How we doing? It's time to start. Come on in, have a seat, get a handout if you did not get one. They're better than the government, I promise. My handouts, woo, I'm just kidding. In the back, they're right back in the back. Sad joke, sorry. Session 9 is where we are tonight. It should say September 1st at the top, session 9. We're going to be talking about the humble little book of Ruth. The humble little book of Ruth. We will probably get into at least the first portion of 1 Samuel, but we're going to say a lot about it before we actually crack it open. And so I don't anticipate we'll get too far into Samuel tonight, but we have plenty of time because I'm the one that decides when this class begins and ends. And so I can just keep going if I want to. I don't mean tonight, but I mean like weeks ahead of time. I will not go any further than 8:15, I promise you, because then I hear from Mrs. Bledsoe, and we don't want that. So I want to honor what I have said I would do for your time as well. But I do think it's helpful, just if you were with me, which I think only probably Miss Carol was in the beginning with me in the first iteration of putting together the Old Testament. At this point, going into Ruth and 1 Samuel, we were in session 5, and we're in session 9 right now. So that tells you I've been a little more, what's a better term than long-winded? More detailed. Thorough. I like that. That sounds very good. Session 9, Ruth and 1 Samuel. Last week we uncovered the very dark time in Israel's existence in the time of the Judges. And again, just to give you a little bit of a time frame of how all this is unfolding, you have the Exodus, right? The patriarchs leading into Egypt. You have the Exodus out of Egypt. You have roughly 40 years in the wilderness. Moses dies, Deuteronomy ends, and Joshua begins with Joshua taking the people of God into the land of Canaan, the promised land, where conquest begins. And they take control of the land, and there they are blessed. Joshua dies, Judges begins, and after the death of Joshua, one of the critical errors that Israel made was not passing along the stories and traditions of God to the next generation. So when this next generation comes along, they're not as familiar with what God has been doing. They're not as familiar with the miraculous things that He has accomplished. They're certainly not as familiar with what God has said specifically in Deuteronomy. So, and this is going to come up tonight, so we might as well talk about it here. If you remember in the Torah, you have the law given at Sinai, you have the 10 Commandments given, and then you have the law developed beyond just those 10 Commandments in Leviticus and Numbers, and then specifically in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy seems to be sort of a rehashing of the law that is put into its historical context, what is called a suzerain vassal treaty. And this is unfolded throughout the entirety of Deuteronomy. It lays out the things that God expects of His people, the things that He expects them not to do, and the covenant details that if you will obey, I will bless. This is how I will bless. If you do not obey, I will remove my hand and judgment will follow. And the two major problems was, one, do not intermarry with people in the land that you are about to receive because they are bad. It's not even that they're bad people. I don't want to couch it in those terms. They're people who are not worshipers of Yahweh. And so don't marry them because that leads to problem number 2. You will end up in idolatry. And if that happens, I take my hand away and judgment falls and it's not good. We got last week into Judges, and what we found out was God was telling the truth. That when you do the things He says not to do, it turns out He does remove His hand. And bad things took place. The Canaanite kings were problem. The Moabite kings were problems. The Ammonites were problems. Eventually, by the end of Judges, there's a civil war breaking out between all of the tribes and particularly Benjamin. And things end very dreadfully very dreadfully for Israel. They're torn. They have murdered a bunch of the women of one tribe. They've kidnapped a bunch of women from another tribe, and they're kind of celebrating it because the guys got wives and the men didn't break their vow, and so God's happy. Somehow their reasoning is so bad that they think this is a good thing, and that illustrates the overarching picture of Judges, which is without a king, without a leader who is bent on obedience to the written word, the people perish. The people suffer. The moral decline happens very quickly. And so Judges begins with the people of God in kind of an okay place after the death of Joshua, and it ends in a very bad place. The moral decline is very clear, and it is even illustrated by the judges themselves. So if you remember, we talked about how Othniel, the first judge, is a man of good character, a righteous man, loves the Lord. The final judge is Samson, a womanizer, does not take the Nazaritic vow very seriously, and ultimately is kind of a failure in a lot of ways. Doesn't even realize that God's power is working through him, makes everything about himself. I mean, honestly, he's a really great picture of us, if we're just being totally honest. We want to be more like Othniel. We're mostly more like Samson. Judges does a great job of showing us, though, what happens when there is not godly leadership at play. Now, all of that is taking place, and then we get to Ruth. And Ruth is a story couched within the Judges timeline. So if you're looking at the timeline, you have the Exodus, you have the whole of the Deuteronomic law, you have Joshua, and then you have Judges. In the middle of this Judges timeline is Ruth. It's just this little standalone story that takes place. And it seems, honestly, kind of out of place. I mean, if we're just being honest, like when you read through the Torah and then into Joshua, they get the land, Judges, things go wrong. Then you get to Samuel, and they're in this kind of bad state, and this prophet is born, and then he comes along and is the prophet to Israel and is eventually responsible for anointing their first king, who is going to set Israel back on track and in fact expand Israel into now not a wandering group of tribes, but a kingdom with a king, a nation that has some kind of physical boundaries. And in the midst of all of that, you just get this random story of Ruth. And it just seems kind of out of place. It's a very weird placement for this book. And yet, there is purpose in Ruth. There are some major things that we learn, and it falls into the same category as Joshua, Judges, and specifically 1st and 2nd Samuel, something that we will call, and we'll talk about it more when we get to Samuel, the Deuteronomic history. Okay, Deuteronomic history. Why is that important? Deuteronomic history. What that means is that these are books that unfold the living out of what was expressed in Deuteronomy, the suzerain vassal treaty. So blessings and curses for obedience and disobedience. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and 1st and 2nd Samuel demonstrate to us how it plays out. All right? Ruth it seems, again, out of place until we read through the whole of it and we realize what's going on here. So let me just start out by saying a lot of names in Ruth that are, again, going to be confusing. They're not going to come off the tongue easily. We're dealing with ancient Near Eastern people. But really, if you want a summary of the three major people in the book of Ruth, there's three major characters, one of whom you can probably guess, the book is named after her, Ruth. There is another woman by the name of Naomi, and then there is a man named Boaz. So Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. This is the kind of outline for the major characters. Now, there are some key themes I've given you here in this handout. Ruth relies heavily upon an understanding of something called the kinsman redeemer. The kinsman redeemer is something that's outlined in Leviticus 25. And just as I put as a side note that Ruth is traditionally, I say traditionally very loosely because I think most scholars have gotten this right for a long time, but it's not uncommon to hear guys talk about Ruth with regard to something else called levirate marriage. Are you familiar with this term, levirate marriage? So a levirate marriage is something that is outlined in Deuteronomy 25. And in Deuteronomy 25, the idea behind the levirate marriage is that if a man is married to a woman and that man dies and has not had children with her, then the brother of that man, in order to redeem that household, is to impregnate the now widowed wife in order to carry on the brother's legacy, such that the children she bears is not the brother's, but it's the original husband who has died. This is a way of propagating the family, if you will, continuing the line, so to speak, levirate marriage. And so this is sometimes applied to the book of Ruth. That's not what is likely going on here. This is probably a better example of kinsman redeemer, which is outlined in Leviticus 25. And in Leviticus 25, it deals with property specifically. When a man dies and his wife is left, the closest family member is to marry her and take possession of that land to redeem that family household and continue the lineage. It looks very similar to levirate marriage, but it is a little bit different, primarily because of the property aspect. And there is some property involved in the story of Ruth, and so just as a side note, one of the themes there. Number two, major theme of Ruth is this idea of loyalty. Loyalty is a big part of Ruth. We see loyalty with regard to Ruth and her relationship to Naomi. We see loyalty with regard to Boaz and his relationship to Ruth, and by extension, Naomi. So these are key themes that kind of traverse these 4 chapters. It's a short book. It's only 4 chapters long. And then finally, we get a clearer definition, I think, of what it means to be a part of the people of God. Up to this point, the people of God are defined not by kingdoms, because we haven't gotten to the monarchy yet. So it's really developed in tribal terminology. You are from a specific tribe of Israel, and your identity within that tribe and as a person in the family of God is sort of confirmed by your obedience to Scripture, specifically, again, to Deuteronomy. Because Deuteronomy is, I don't know that I mentioned this earlier, I don't think I did. Deuteronomy is the re-giving of the law. I said that it's in the suzerain vassal treaty, but importantly, it's given to that second wilderness generation. So in the wilderness, 40 years, that first generation that comes out of Egypt, they all die. And so this new generation of people need a law given to them as well. So Deuteronomy is the rehashing of that out. And Ruth, I think, presents this picture of what it means to have identity as a person in God's family. It's not only that you are a part of a tribe, but specifically that you're obedient to Deuteronomic law. And we find that. I'm going to just summarize. I don't think I'm going to read too much. I've got some verses here that I will read off to you. We'll start with verse 1, and then I'm going to kind of fill in the blanks because I want you to get the thrust of this story. I think it will make sense in the end when we kind of talk about why it's here. Verse 1 of chapter 1, it says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man in Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of the 2 sons Mahlon and Kilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And these 2 took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, not to be confused with Oprah, right? Very similar, just switch the letters. And the name of the other, Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Kilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband." So stop for a moment. We're in the time of Judges. That's where we get the idea that Ruth is during this time frame. The judges are reigning. It's a dark time in Israel, and more than that, it's a famine. So they are very concerned about their well-being. How are we going to live? How are we going to survive? How are we going to eat? And so they leave, which is kind of the beginning of a problem, right? Don't want to go into Moab, but they do anyways. And when they get there, Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, dies. We're not told how, but he dies. She has 2 sons, and so they, while they are there, break Deuteronomic law by what? Marrying Moabite women. Not supposed to do that. But they do anyways, and therein lies the next issue. Not too long after that, the two sons die. So now Naomi is in a foreign land with her husband dead, her two sons dead, and two wives who are not even Israelites living with her. And so there's nothing really left for Naomi at this point. There's no real reason to stay in Moab. And so she decides, I am going to leave. I'm going to go back. And she decides, before I go to Judah, I'm going to release Orpah and Ruth to stay here, because this is their homeland. There's no reason why they would want to come with me to Judah. It'll be a foreign land. There'll be foreign women. That's not looked kindly upon in Judah. And so I'm going to release them to stay. Orpah takes her up on that agreement, says, great, I like it here. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to move back home or whatever. But Ruth says, no way. I'm coming with you. Wherever you go, I will go, and there I will be. Right? Now, this passage, I want to say this, and I want to say it. I want to say it without any sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? I want to say it with seriousness, okay? Because it's one of those things that I think is very easy to kind of poke fun at, and really this is more sad than anything else. This idea of Ruth telling Naomi that she is going to stay, or she is going to go with her, and wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you stay, I will stay, and so on and so forth. This is one of the proof texts that has been used in churches to advocate for same-sex marriage. And the idea here is that Ruth had a romantic love for Naomi. And this is the text that is used. And I point this out to say that this question comes up a lot. You know, how do churches get around these texts that are so clear about homosexual union? And there's always these verses, right, that churches will kind of throw out there as their proof for what they're doing. This is one of them, and I bring it up because hopefully you can see throughout the course of at least tonight's study how bad that is in terms of interpretation. It's very out of context. It's very much reading into something that is not there. We know that because Ruth is going to go on and marry a man. Now, Ruth's commitment to, or I'll use that term that I brought up in that second point in the key themes, her loyalty to Naomi is intentional, and it is expressed intentionally because it is setting a precedent for something that's going to take place here in the overarching narrative. So I want to bring these kinds of things up to you as much as I can, because I know it's a question that many people have of, well, where do churches get this idea? What passages are they using to validate this stance? It's passages like this. These are just ripped right out of context to serve a greater purpose. And more than anything, it's sad because it shows a need to justify something and use Scripture as a tool or as a means to justify that agenda. And that is very, very bad territory whenever we get into that position. That's what we would call eisegesis, not exegesis. Exegesis is reading from or out of the text. Eisegesis is reading into the text. It's finding some kind of text that you can use as a proof to push out whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. And it's not good interpretation. And it often lands us in problem spots. So I want to bring that up to you just as a side note. So that is kind of the end of chapter 1. They leave Moab. They go back to Judah. Naomi changes her name to Mara, which means like bitterness, because the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. That's in verse 20. She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So chapter 1 ends with Naomi believing that God has somehow judging her. He has taken from her. And so she is leaving Moab, going back to Judah, and she has with her Ruth, who is committed to her. Chapter 2 begins this way. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." And so she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. Now this is an important detail that we might miss. Remember that this is a time of famine. They're very hungry. And it just so happens that it's also harvest time in Judah. Great timing. Providential timing. And so she gets there, she's out in the fields gleaning, trying to get food, and who does she run into but Boaz? And it happens that Boaz is the relative of Naomi, of Elimelech. And so, Ruth comes back to Naomi and says, "I've met a man, and his name was Boaz, and it turns out he is your relative." And Ruth suddenly hit with this idea, maybe God is not done with my family yet. Maybe Boaz is going to be our kinsman redeemer. Maybe he can marry you and the line can stay intact, and Elimelech's line will continue, and God's faithfulness to us will continue as well. And so this is the plan that they sort of hatch together, and the chapter 2 ends with this rejoicing that takes place that maybe God is going to do something incredible here. So chapter 3 opens, and it says, "Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, 'My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he had finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, and then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do.' And she replied, 'All that you say, I will do.'" So here's what's happening here. Boaz tonight is going to be down in the threshing floor, taking in the harvest. I want you, Ruth, to take off your mourning clothes because you've been a widow, your husband has died. It's time to dress like a woman ready for marriage. So put on the marriage garments and go down there and sit down. Don't immediately start talking to him, okay? Let him eat and drink, but just sit down and wait. And when the conversation begins, there's your opportunity. You're going to mention to him this kinsman redeemer proposition and see if he'll go for it. So another plan is hatched, right? She goes to the threshing floor. The way the verbiage is written in here, it says, let's see here, in verse 7, "When Boaz had eaten and drunk, his heart was merry. He went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet. And at midnight the man was startled and turned over." Wakes up and there's a strange woman laying by him. What is happening, right? Startles him. And she says, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." In other words, want to get married. We can fix this whole thing, right? Boaz agrees. And so chapter 3 ends with Ruth coming back to Naomi once again and hatching the details of the plan to her and rejoicing that God is actually acting on our behalf. This is going to happen. Chapter 4 opens. They go down to the gate of the city, which is common in this time. You would settle disputes. You would do any kind of transactions for property, hence the kinsman redeemer, at the gate, the city gate, where there are a lot of witnesses, a lot of people, elders of the town, so on and so forth. And Boaz, being the honest and loyal individual that he is, realizes overnight, while he's thinking about marrying sweet Ruth, that actually there's someone in Elimelech's family who is a closer relative than I am. And by law, he should be the one to marry you. And so, of course, to the dismay of Ruth and Naomi, they're a little shocked by this. But when the man figures out that the woman he's marrying is not an Israelite, but a Moabite, he declines. And that puts who up into that position now? Boaz, right? And so Boaz comes in and he marries Ruth and saves the day. And you even get this language here in chapter 4. It's in verse 11. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be known in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." There's hope restored. The line is going to continue. You even get down here in verse 14. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer." There's that redeemer language again. "And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." So the story ends happily. Ruth is married. She conceives. Now, I want to point out a couple of things that I think are important here and then talk about where this fits in and why it's here. I want you to notice some corresponding parts. There are things that happen in Ruth Ruth is written with intentional design to it. Hebrew literature and ancient Near Eastern literature is often written with a literary device called chiasm. Chiasm, I've talked about it before. We talked about it in Genesis. We've talked about it in several other places, where the structure of the literature is done in such a way to emphasize a central point or corresponding point. So remember in Genesis chapter 1, when we're given the creation narrative, we have the first 6 days of creation. Remember, I pointed out that actually when you look at it, it's written in chiastic form, meaning that days 1 and 4 correspond with one another. Days 2 and 5 correspond with one another, and then days 3 and 6 correspond with one another. You have in Genesis chapter 1, God saying, "Let there be light." In day 4, you have the actual distinction of the sun, moon, and the lesser lights, the stars. In day 2, you have the bringing forth of water and sky. In day 5, you have the creation of the sea-dwelling creatures and the sky-dwelling creatures. In day 3, you have land emerge and vegetation sprout. In day 6, you have beasts of the field that are created that eat on the vegetation in the earth. There's chiasm. And what that's doing then is it's setting us up, because how many days of creation are there in total? 7, correct. So when we see 1 and 4, 2 and 5, 3 and 6, what are we left with? 7. That's meant to show us something. That's meant to direct us to something. 7 doesn't correspond to anything. It's the central focus of that narrative. And as it turns out, that's what the literature tells us, that on this day, unlike any other day in creation, this day is special because it is the day that God rests after he creates. And it sets a standard for all of creation to take Sabbath once a week. An entire theology is built off of this one day. So chiasm is done with intentionality to show us or highlight to us something in the structure, right? Ruth is done in a similar manner. So Ruth begins with tragedy and death. We have famine, we have this weird move to Moab, and then we have Elimelech and his 2 sons die. And it seems like at that point, there is no hope for Naomi and that family. But what do we find in the midst of that? We find loyalty with Ruth. Ruth remains loyal to Naomi. When you flash all the way over to the end of Ruth, what does it end with? It ends with rejoicing, with life. There's a marriage that takes place, and there is literal life that comes forth from this union and this child that Ruth gives birth to. And that is a result of the loyalty of Boaz to Ruth and Naomi. They're bookends to this whole story. When you look at chapters 2 and 3 side by side to one another, what you find is that the beginning of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3 both start with Ruth and Naomi hatching a plan. In chapter 2, it's go out in the fields and glean and get food. In chapter 3, it's go lay down on the threshing floor and see if Boaz will marry you. In chapters 2 and 3, in the middle portions, what do you have? You have interaction between Ruth and Boaz. At the end of chapters 2 and 3, what do you have? Naomi and Ruth rejoicing that the plan that they came up with in the beginning of each chapter is coming to fruition. There's harmony here in this design. So this kind of organization of literature is not quite the same as Genesis 1. It's not highlighting a central point that's sort of left out or an odd, kind of the oddball, but it is showing kind of a divine weaving of God's providence for this family. And that brings me to another point here that I think is really important on the presence of God in the book of Ruth. God never actually speaks in Ruth. We don't ever see God come down and say, "Thus says the Lord, you shall go do this," or "You shall go do that," or "Boaz, I say to you, take this one." You never see this. What you find is a very human story in Ruth. And you find providence taking place in the midst of these very human details. One of the reasons I think Ruth is very powerful is because Ruth demonstrates to us God's providential work even in times when we doubt that He is for us. So for Naomi, her story begins in Ruth with tragedy and death, and it seems like things are so bad that she needs to change her name to Mara because God has dealt bitterly with me. He brought me out here with a full basket, and it's empty by the time I'm leaving. But what we find actually is that He brought her out to Moab to meet Ruth, whom He would use to bring Boaz into the mix to redeem this family once and for all. Really a cool kind of connecting point. I think that's an important detail because we never see God showing His cards in this story, and yet clearly He's working through the details throughout the entirety of it. And that brings up the final point that I will say that I think is really an interesting point, which is its placement. Why is it placed here? Why did they include this here? Well, what is coming next? What do we have after this? We have Samuel. And you're going to hear me refer to it both interchangeably as Samuel and 1 Samuel. I'll tell you why here in a moment. But who is the central character in Samuel? Samuel's not. I'm not going to nick you for saying Samuel. The book is named after him, but there is actually probably a more central character in Samuel throughout its entirety, and that is David. David becomes king, at the very end, and really the rise of David's ascension is in 2 Samuel, the very beginning of 2 Samuel, but his story begins early in 1 Samuel as this young kid, basically, the armor bearer of Saul and the musician, and there's lots of things we learn about David. David's an incredibly important person. And right at the end of Ruth, you have this. This is in verse 15. He shall be a restorer of life. This is talking about Boaz, a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A man has been born to Naomi." And they named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Ruth has an incredibly intentional place in this Deuteronomic history. Because coming out of the judge era, we're going into the monarchy, and we need to know how in the world David and Jesse, this man with all these sons, how did they come about? Where did they come from? We're going to be introduced to him as the king of Israel, the quintessential idea of what it means to be a king of Israel. And so he better be someone special. He better be someone with a lineage that is really revealing about God's dealings with his family. And it turns out he is, just not in the way that you would expect. He's not royalty for several generations. He's the descendant of a Moabite, a foreigner, one of the women that God said don't marry. And so this brings up the final point here regarding the people of God's definition. What does it mean truly to be a person in God's family in the Old Testament? Certainly, tribal affiliation is helpful. There's no question about that. And depending on which region you're in this territory during this time, is going to be a great determining factor in how you're dealt with if you're not in one of those tribes. But we cannot define the people of God in purely tribal terms, because here we have Ruth, a Moabite, a foreigner, in the lineage of David, who ultimately is in the lineage of who? Jesus. So, if that's the case, then how do we better define someone in the people of God? And I'm going to come back to what we talked about in the beginning, the Deuteronomic history. It's someone who is obedient to God's law. Someone who desires to worship and follow and obey Yahweh. And that is what we find in Ruth. She is loyal to Naomi. And she is so loyal that she takes on her God. She says, not only, wherever you go will I go, and wherever you stay I'll stay, but whichever God you worship, that will be my God. In other words, I'm all in on this. At that point, she becomes more of an Israelite in the New Testament sense than many of the Israelites during her time, because she's faithful and obedient. And Paul is going to go on later and tell us in the New Testament that not all who are of Israel are truly Israel. But there's a spiritual Israel that's even more important, and it's those who love God and keep His commandments. It's why Jesus goes on to say, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. You will obey me. Love and obedience always walk hand in hand throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. And they're markers for the Christian or the person of God's identity within the people of God. And Ruth really typifies that for us. Any questions so far? Yes?
So, the guy that Boaz says, wait a second, he is closer in line, so you should marry him.
Right.
He comes in because he is related to Naomi. He comes in and says, oh, not you're a Moabite, never mind. So, then how is it okay for Boaz to marry her because he's in the same position?
Yeah. So I think this is, I can't speak super authoritatively to this. When you read the actual text, it says, down in, let's see here, verse 5. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Right? So this is all about land for this other redeemer. And it says, then the redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. And then Boaz said to the elders of all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought the hand of Naomi and all that belonged to Elimelech. My best judgment here is it's either one of two things. One, he is couching religious terminology and sort of using it as a veil to hide the fact that he doesn't really want to marry this foreigner. And I don't know that we want to beat him up too much for that, because technically he's not supposed to.
I was going to say, isn't that like, yeah.
But the fact remains that though she's a Moabite, she's the wife of a deceased Israelite. Yeah. And so then the other kind of thing that might be going on here is that Boaz may not have some inheritance that he's worried about messing up. And so he's like, I don't have as much to lose, so I'll marry her and I'll take the land.
Well, then why didn't Boaz marry Naomi in the same family line?
It has more to do with, in a transactional situation like this, part of it does have to do with perpetuating the name, and Naomi is outside of childbearing. So Ruth is, next in line. Yeah?
My question is way less good than that. it's the one that I have. It's
Yeah.
the one that I have.
Hey, it's all good.
So to repaint the picture, Naomi and Ruth discover Boaz, and they know that he is a potential kinsman redeemer. And so they're hatching their plan. They're stoked about it. We're going to ask this guy for marriage. And for some reason, maybe there's some historical or cultural context behind this, they decide that the best plan of action is to ambush him with a marriage proposal while he's asleep. Like, that just sounds psychotic. Anybody else? Like, that's so weird.
Yeah.
Like, is there anything in the culture, in the historical context that just, like, is this something that people did? Or is this like
Yeah.
the start of an SVU episode?
Right.
This is super weird.
Yeah, it does. It feels very much, you're right, like the start of an SVU episode. Kung, kung. So, yes, to answer your question, there is a lot of historical, cultural things going on here. I mean, you even get it at the end. Like, he takes his sandal off, right? If I'm standing in a public square and a guy takes his sandal off and, like, tosses it up, I'm like, what drugs is he on, right? And who's he about to lose his mind on here? There are a lot of these things when we read the Old Testament where it doesn't seem normal or it doesn't make as much sense. Now, I do think that there is something. I don't want to just completely culturalize this. Boaz is kind of terrified. I mean, it literally says he's startled. He's shaken. But he says yes anyways. So I think that what you're witnessing here is that Boaz is performing a agricultural act that, again, is kind of foreign to us. He is in the middle of eating and drinking at the end of his day, and there would have been some cultural norms that a woman would not just approach a man and begin dialoguing, or because there was this whole patriarchal thing that was happening there. So the way she presents herself is not wrong either. It's from a place of humility. Staying at his feet signifies a submission to him. So there's some imagery there that is, I think, important for us to gather. I also don't want to romanticize the story either. So let me just say as a side note that everything that we read in the specifically Old Testament and really the New Testament as well is read through a lens, whether we like it or not, of this sort of romanticized view of marriage. We are brought up with this, quite frankly, lie that everyone has their soulmate, right? There's that one person out there that God has for you, and that's just categorically not true. God is sovereign, and I believe that He sovereignly, especially in examples like this, works to bring people together to accomplish His purposes. Boaz and Ruth go on to eventually lead to David, and then eventually again to Jesus. So their role in bringing the Messiah into the incarnation is, I think, very special and sort of in its own category. But the Bible never teaches nor upholds anything regarding soulmates, right? Or that marriage is meant to be primarily romantic. Now, that is not to say that it does not have a romantic aspect to it. There's a whole book in the Bible committed to sex, basically, in the Song of Solomon. We're going to talk about it when we get there. But it's not the primary lens of it is not this sort of like playhouse, let's be, husband and wife in the kind of American sense that you often think of. Ruth and Boaz get married having basically never met one another, right? Mary and Joseph, the birth mother of Jesus, are like teenagers when they are brought together in betrothal, which is a practice in the ancient world where they live together but do not have sexual relationship with one another so that they can get to know one another a little bit before they eventually get to the sexual relationship because they're already betrothed and going to get married, right? You find these stories of fathers with daughters who make men work for several years before they can take their daughters in marriage and then trick them the night of and give them the other daughter so that he can stay another 7 years to work for the second one. This is not like something that I would envision for Camilla and Victoria. First of all, my land is not that big, but second of all, that's not really the vision of marriage that we have today. And so I say all that to say, we can sometimes be guilty of reading these stories of men and women being brought together and think like, oh, it was so sweet, and Boaz had a twinkle in his eye, and he loved her, and I don't know that we're meant to take that away either. I think we have to just read it kind of historically for what it is. Case in point, this is just a side note, this is free, I didn't plan on talking about this tonight, but it illustrates well what I'm talking about. How many of you have seen the classic, The Sound of Music? Yes. Okay, now I've got a confession. I went a week and a half ago to see the musical. Tim Bass starred in it, and the production in Hearst. And he did an incredible job. He was the commander, the captain, and really, really just awesome. And I was so excited. We brought Cam and Tori and Lydia, and I'm thinking like, man, they've never seen this before. It's going to be great. And it opened up, and about 10 minutes in, I was sitting there, and I realized I've never seen this before. Like, I was certain I had seen The Sound of Music, and I'd never seen it. So the next night, we went home, and we watched it together. And I was so enchanted by it. I mean, I'm just going to be honest. It's, 1969. I think it's some of the most incredible cinematography I've ever seen. It's really, really phenomenal, and the performances were great. But I got kind of enamored with the story, and so I wanted to know a little bit more. I'm a little bit of a historic guy. I love history, and so I started reading about the book that the movie is based upon, or the musical is based upon, called the Singing Von Trapp Sisters. I think is what it was called. Singing Von Trapp Children, maybe. I don't remember. And it's an account, a historical account of the Von Trapp family and how all of this stuff unfolded. Except not as good in real life. Like, she wasn't really the governess. She was just a tutorer for one of the kids when they got sick for a year. And they married really more as like a mutual agreement because she had left the nunnery and he needed a woman in the house to raise his kids. And so it just kind of worked out well for them. And now she does go on to say eventually that, like, I did fall in love with him, but it was like a decade after they got married. They had kids. They had actual, like, multiple children before she really fell in love with the guy. So ladies, again, just like, put yourself in that position for a minute. You're having children with a man that takes you longer than having children does to fall in love with him. This is not how we think of marriage in the world today. But The Sound of Musical made a great movie and a great musical, and it's way better if they're in love. And so that's how it was done. And that's kind of my point, is Ruth is a much better story if there's this sort of like tension and romance in the air, and but Boaz is almost not going to get to marry her because there's this other guy, but he's kind of a racist. So,
Close one.
Right. And I just want to present to you the reality that that's probably not what's going on. That's probably not what's going on. Still a great story. I'm not going to say that, Kelsey. Kelsey wants me to say a meme that we saw today that we came across. Checksegesis before you rexegesis. It's a play on exegesis. It's a terrible joke. That's why I didn't say it. See, it got no laughs. Any other questions or thoughts on Ruth? Yes. Right. Yeah. Again, understand land and the ancient world, it's a pretty big deal. It's a pretty big deal. And if you are a law-abiding Israelite, then kinsman redeemership and obedience is a pretty big deal. And so, I mean, we're not told really anything about this. Now, it seems like, I think it seems reasonable at least to take away that, they didn't hate this plan. Like Ruth was all about trying to work this thing out where she's going to marry Boaz. And Boaz doesn't seem all that resistant. And again, I don't want to humanize the story more and like read into our own culture to the story on him, but the man is a farmer and he's single and he spends his days in the field. And so I imagine when you're spending years of your life in a field and all of a sudden one day a woman pops up in the field and it's like, want to get married? That seems kind of providential for Boaz as well. Because again, this means This means offspring. This means people to help with the land. It's a bartering tool. If you have daughters, you can marry them off, and there's all kinds of reward that comes with that. And that seems so horrible to think in those terms, but we just have to put ourselves in that place and understand that that was the mindset then. People were also commodities. Children were commodities. This, man, I could go on so many little rabbit trails. I'm going to try not to, but I think it really does. I think it's so difficult to wrap ourselves around these kinds of stories because of the way that children, wives, husbands are almost idolized in our culture today. Bart and I were actually talking about this on Sunday, a podcast by a couple of individuals who remind me the Cloud and Townsend, yeah, authors of some of the books that we use here. And this is one of the things that when we're talking about like the sort of idolization or lifting up or propping up of family members, it is most prominent. These guys are clinical psychiatrists, is that right, or clinical psychologists? They find this most prominently in the church more than anywhere else. Churches, Christian people tend to prop up and nearly idolize their family members. So it's ironic to me, actually, that the very people who should be reading stories like Ruth and stories like Jacob and Isaac and Abraham, we are the ones of all people who are like fly to the opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to how we think about and treat our families. And so if you don't think that shades the way that these stories are told in churches, then you're crazy. It absolutely does. It absolutely does. So we have to get under our own context and our own disposition towards family and what it means to be a father and a mother and a husband and wife and all the things that culture has influenced for us before we can really understand what was going on in these texts. And I don't think we can ever really get there. If you want my honest opinion, we can get enough to be able to get the stories and, Scripture is sufficient, all that stuff, but I don't know that we ever break free fully from the lenses through which we read these stories. It's a very difficult process, I imagine, because it's our only experience. It's our only context that we've been brought up in, which is why traveling and befriending people from different cultures is invaluable for a variety of reasons, but one of which is that they will show you that the way you do things is not the only way to do things, and it's sometimes actually weird. That was also free. Any other questions? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so for those of you online, the question is regarding if this was more of an example of levirate marriage, would this be mentioning Elimelech rather than Boaz? So maybe. I don't know. I'm not really sure. I don't know that we have any examples where we see genealogies and the way that they're affected. I think the main consideration here is in the terminology in chapter 4, before they actually are brought together, is the whole thing centers around the purchase of land. And with the land comes the Moabite woman. So if it were a levirate marriage, it would be purely from the vantage point of having children with this woman who is barren and in need of the continuation of the line. That would be the emphasis. The fact that she has a child is important because of who the child becomes. But the emphasis of the transaction is really more to do with the land than the marriage. Does that answer that?
Yes. Are there other examples, though, where the first husband is mentioned in the genealogy, even though after he may have passed?
Yeah, I don't know of any. That's what I was saying. I'm not sure. There may be some. I haven't done like an in-depth, rigorous an in-depth, that was weird, in-depth, rigorous look at levirate marriages in genealogies. I don't know that there are any. It's doing it again. What is happening there? Is it losing battery, Kelsey? I don't know. I'm going to check it. You got it. You got new batteries. I don't know. Maybe it's a dead spot. By the way, I'm using a new microphone tonight, and It was, up until this point, working incredibly well. Much clearer, hopefully, than the one previous. Any other questions? Questions are good. That's why we're here. That's why we open it up. You know, I will say on that note, I'm reading a book right now on the theology of education. And this is the field that I am writing and researching in right now for a doctorate. And one of the things that has been really kind of swirling around in my mind over the last couple of weeks is the different types of educational formats in the church and in other, it's not just in the church, but in higher education institutions as well. And there are three like major categories. So you have formal education, which is going to be like objective-based, remember these things, you're going to be tested at the end, and this is what we expect from you, right? And then you have non-formal, which is more of like applicational, how to do certain things. So one of the examples that's used is boot camp in the military. Boot camp is a great example of non-formal education. When you go into boot camp, you're probably not going to learn the history and theory of hand grenades, but you're going to learn how to use them. Right? It's very hands-on. It's more seminar, workshop-oriented in the church today. And then you have something called socialization. And socialization is something, it's probably honestly the most powerful learning tool, even though it's the least talked about. But when you come into a church, for example, on a Sunday or Wednesday night, and you see the people in the church dressed a certain way, you see the pastors dressed a certain way, carrying themselves in a very like meaningful, personal kind of way, you learn something about how to behave and what is appropriate and what is not appropriate in that environment. My hope is that when you walk into a class, let's say like one tonight, you're going to come away with a different socialized lesson than you would in, let's say, a First Baptist somewhere. You're going to hopefully feel like you can say things or ask questions in a freer format here than you would in like a Church of Christ or something like that. And that's no knock against the Church of Christ, just the religious kind of fervor that people carry in some of these other denominations is much higher than one in like City on a Hill. And I mean that in a good way. I think there's good religious fervor, there's bad religious fervor. We try to have good religious fervor and not the bad kind. And so the social aspect is important. It's one of the reasons why I like this class so much. This is what made me think about this, is that the kind of interaction that we can have in here and the kind of questions that are on the table in here are as important as the material that I'm presenting. Because it's forming you in some ways in your identity here at City on a Hill. And when other people come in who have not been in this class before, it teaches them something about the nature of who we are and that we take this very seriously, but we don't take ourselves too seriously. And so it's okay to ask questions that are weird or maybe even off topic a little bit, and totally fine. That's why we're here. We're here to grow. And that social aspect, man, it's so important. It's one of the reasons why the pandemic is so devastating, honestly, to churches. Because in a virtual setting, what you have is a lot of formal education taking place, a lot of good information, but you have very little application happening because there's no community, and you have virtually no socialization because you're not here. You're looking at someone on a screen, and then it goes off, and you're in your living room. You've never left. And I think there's a time and place for that, and certainly it has served us well in certain capacities, but it's a really interesting problem the church faces because so much of what we do depends upon those other two aspects of learning, and those are ripped away in that virtual component. So ask the questions, and bring as many of them as you have. I spent whole class periods when we did putting together the New Testament, some of you were with me, where we literally never even covered the material. It's like I would start reading a verse, and I was about to start on the first point, someone asked a question, and an hour later, we were wrapping up and never even covered the point. And they were some of the best classes we had because they were really good questions, and they really were good conversations as a result. So no other questions? We'll move on to 1st and 2nd Samuel. All right. So I'm going to, like I said a moment ago, refer to this as Samuel. Probably refer to it as 1st or 2nd Samuel if I'm giving you specific addresses for verses, but why do I call it Samuel? I call it Samuel because that's actually its original name. It's not called anything else. It's just one book. It's later divided into two books in the Septuagint called First and Second Kingdoms, probably because of the length. But Samuel is to be viewed as one collective story. Why might that be the case? Any thoughts? Why would 1st and 2nd Samuel have been one unit of thought? Because really, when you view 1st and 2nd Samuel together, what you find is the primary narrative is not about Samuel, it's about David. And in 1 Samuel, like I said, you see the rise of David onto the scene as this young boy who is taken into the service of Saul, the first king. And by the beginning of 2 Samuel, you have David as the unifying king of all of the land. And so Samuel as a whole is remarkably important for a variety of reasons. There's some really important themes here in Samuel. And like I said, we may not even get into the text tonight. We've got about 20 minutes left, give or take, and we'll see how long it takes us to get through just this introductory point. But I think this is important for you to get this. Samuel is all about Deuteronomic fulfillment. So I mentioned that it's a part of this so-called Deuteronomic history, where we're seeing the law in Deuteronomy lived out in Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and then in Samuel. And we see it in a couple of ways. So if you go to the back, point 1, Deuteronomy spoke of a time when the people of Israel would have a king. So if you go to Deuteronomy chapter 17, what you find, and we read this when we were in Deuteronomy, I made sure to point it out because it kind of sticks out like a sore thumb in its context until you see what it's leading up to. It talks about a time when Israel would have a king. Deuteronomy 17, starting in verse 14. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you, who is not your brother, and only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not require many wives for himself, Solomon, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. Don't go back to Egypt. Don't marry a bunch of women. Don't build a lot of wealth and power. It will not work out well when it happens. Deuteronomy predicts, it forecasts that Israel is going to come to a point where they're going to want a king. They're going to want, why? And it tells us in here, why do they want a king? Because the other nations around them have kings. And by golly, we need a king. You know? They all have, this is such human nature, isn't it? Well, all of them have bikes. I need a bike. Well, all those guys have sports cars, so I need a sports car. Well, all those guys have a big house, so I need it. This is how the mind works. And so God was like, yeah, you're going to get into the land. There's going to be a bunch of people around you. They're going to have kings. You're going to want to, just trust me, you're going to want a king. And so when you elect one, make sure he's an Israelite, make sure he doesn't go back to Egypt, make sure he doesn't marry foreign women, and make sure he doesn't possess a whole lot of wealth and power. That's kind of what it's setting up. We get to 1 Samuel 8:5, and we find a fulfillment of exactly what Deuteronomy predicts. Starting in verse 4, then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. That's not good. But we do find Deuteronomic fulfillment here. Deuteronomy forecasts they'll want a king like the other nations, and that's exactly what we find happening. As I said, they're going to want, these kings are going to want all the power, all the horses, all the women, all the things. Look at 1 Samuel 8:10. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. And he said, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his servants. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will make the tenth of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in the day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourself, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Keep reading. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us. That way we may also be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Just stupid people. Stupid people. Nothing has changed at all. They're still completely blind. Deuteronomy also tells us that the king should be careful to be obedient to the commandments of the Lord. In 1 Samuel 10, verse 25. Then Samuel told the people the rights and the duties of the kingship, and he wrote them in a book and laid it up before Yahweh. And then Samuel sent all the people away, each one to his own home. And Saul also went to his home in Gibeah, and with him went men of valor whose hearts God had touched. So interesting couple points here. Number one, we see Saul doing exactly what Deuteronomy says, which is have a king who's going to be obedient to the written word. What does Saul do, or what does Samuel do? He writes out a bunch of commandments for him and gives the book to Saul. Here you go, buddy. Here's your kingship. Be sure to do everything that's written in it. But notice where it says Saul is going back to. Gibeah. Do we remember that area from last week's discussion? No, but it was like it. I mentioned that it was like Sodom and Gomorrah. It is the place where the concubine was essentially raped to death, and where that individual took and then cut her body into several pieces and sent it to the 12 tribes. So again, I've mentioned this before in this class. It's helpful to have, I use red in mine just as a point of reference, to circle geographical spots, because these spots continue to come up over and over again in your study, specifically of the Old Testament. This is one of those examples. Last time we saw Gibeah was in Judges, and it was not a good place. Now we're seeing the king go back to Gibeah. What does that say about the character of the king? He's not from a very good place. That demonstrates very, very bad, ungodly character. Yeah. And so it shouldn't surprise us then when Saul begins to act like Saul begins to act. And we'll get to that next week. We won't have time tonight to do that. So that's the first thing. We see this longing for a king, and Deuteronomy forecasts the way it's going to happen and what is going to be necessary, and we find fulfillment for those things in 1 Samuel specifically. Number two, Deuteronomy also speaks of a day when Israel would have rest from the enemies surrounding her and an eventual place of worship where God will have his dwelling place. We find in 2 Samuel, after the rise of David, that David has secured peace and unity on every side of the kingdom. He has accomplished what Deuteronomy promised, what we thought might be the case in Joshua, but except, oh wait, the people didn't do what they were supposed to do. They didn't run out the Canaanites all the way. They didn't run out the Ammonites all the way. They were not obedient, and so this remnant of these foreign nations remained. David, on the other hand, takes that and brings it to its fruition. So now there's peace on every side of the kingdom. And beyond that, God says, when that happens, there will be a time when you will build for me a dwelling place. And it takes us to 2 Samuel chapter 7. It says, now when the king lived in his house and the Lord had given him rest from all of his surrounding enemies, the king said to Nathan the prophet, see now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent. And Nathan said to the king, go and do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you. But that same night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, would you build me a house to dwell in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in the tent for my dwelling. In all places where I have moved with all my people of Israel did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people of Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people of Israel. And I have been with you wherever you went, and I have cut off all of your enemies before you, and I will make for you a great name like the name of the great ones, and I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place, and be disturbed no more, and violent men shall afflict them no more, as formerly from the time I appointed judges over my people. God just says, build me a house. I've done a lot of things for you. I like this. This is kind of an interesting appeal that God makes to Nathan to go to David and talk to him. Certainly God is not, he's God. Nothing is hard for him. So we're not meant to think like, poor God, he's been in a tent his whole life, right? I mean, that's not at all the message that God is intending to send. But I think he is appealing to the human nature of Nathan and David, in that you and I wouldn't want to live in a tent our whole lives, traveling everywhere and being around all these violent people. And if it's not good for us, it's certainly not appropriate for God. If I live in a house made of cedar, if I live in a good, sturdy home, why should I not also build a house for the Lord? It's good reasoning. And we find that fulfilled here in these books as well, or at least the beginning discussions of it. We don't really see it come to fruition until Kings and Chronicles. Really, Kings is actually a continuation of Samuel. So Samuel you have 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th kingdoms in Septuagint. And Kings is brought into that discussion as well, because we see the building of the temple and so on and so forth. Number 3, Deuteronomy is heavy on God's blessing and obedience and God's judgment when they do not. And God reiterates this in 2 Samuel 7 through 9. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, it is written. And we know that implicitly. We'll talk about it more when we get to the book of Ezra. So Ezra uncovers a book. We're not told what, but I mentioned this in our discussion about Deuteronomy, that everything that Ezra institutes mirrors the Deuteronomic law, not the Exodus law. And the Exodus law, there are certain commandments given with regard to Passover. Those change in Deuteronomy. They're more communal and less just individual family. When Ezra institutes them, they're communal, not family-driven. And there's several other examples as well. I can get you that handout. I had those outlined in there if you didn't get it, if you weren't here for that. But yes, it was bound in some written version. Yeah. Yeah, so that's also a good question. Did everyone have access to it? So it would have been primarily priests who would have had access to it, who would have taught from it. But it was not like a time in let's say, during like Martin Luther's era, if we're thinking like Reformed times when people couldn't read the Bible because it wasn't in their language. Obviously, this is in Hebrew. They speak Hebrew. They would have been literate. Yeah, they would have had. There's a lot of evidence that again, educational practices were very firmly entrenched into Hebrew life. So it wouldn't have been like, you didn't have a Kindle, you couldn't just go and download it, but you certainly would have had access to the right proper channels to be able to read it. Yeah. Any other questions on that? Good. Not good. I'm not like, it's not bad. It sounded like good. Yeah, I literally just said I like questions, so don't read that wrong. So we have Deuteronomic fulfillment in Samuel, but more than that, and we'll end, this is a good place to end. We have messianic imagery and theology that develops heavily out of Samuel. So with David is a important character in the scripture for more reasons than one. David is an important king because he unifies the kingdom. He runs out and sees the fulfillment of this peaceful conquest, coming to its fruition. He builds the temple, although technically it depends on the account. So the King's account, it seems like Solomon's actually the one that builds the temple. When you read the Chronicles account, Solomon is building it, but David has gotten everything together for him, all the supplies. He's basically done all the heavy work. Solomon kind of gets the credit for it, but really it was David that organized the whole thing, which is an interesting kind of discrepancy. The role of David, though, is so much more important in terms of what it means to be a Davidic king. Because David is who he is, because he is anointed by God to be the king and chosen by God to be the king, not the people of Israel, because that is the big tension in 1 Samuel. The people select Saul. Saul is from Gibeah. He's not a man of character. He does not do what God asks him to do. And there's actually a really crazy, awesome story where Saul is supposed to, I think it's the Philistines, slaughter all the Philistines and their livestock and everyone, and it's just supposed to be this massive bloodbath. And he doesn't. He keeps the king, and he keeps some of their livestock, and he keeps some of their people. And Samuel comes down, having heard that Saul disobeyed God, and just pulls out the sword and hacks this king into pieces in front of Saul. It's crazy. Here I go with violence again. I promise I'm not a violent guy, but it's a cool story. All that to say, that's the tension with David, is that Saul is a selection of the people, David is a selection of the Lord. He's anointed by God, and he has a special relationship with God that no other king has. So again, in 2 Samuel 7, if you keep reading, he says, I will establish his kingdom, and then verse 13, he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. That's an important verse. So David is going to build my house, and I am going to establish the Davidic throne forever. That means even to now, the Davidic throne is an important part of Christian theology. Now, that has been fulfilled. Someone is currently sitting on the Davidic throne, and that is Jesus. Yeah, it's a good Sunday school answer. But then notice what he says right after that. This is so important. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. So the Davidic king becomes a type of son to God the Father, a picture of God the Father and his son. The way he relates to his son, the way he speaks to his son, the way he protects his son, the covenant that he makes with his son, these are important foreshadowing for the direction that God is moving us. If you flip over to Psalm chapter 2, what you find is a psalm written by David. And it says, "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves against the rulers. Set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed." Now that word there in Hebrew, anyone know what that is in Hebrew? It's the word that could be translated Messiah. The anointed is the Messiah. Interestingly, David is anointed when he is brought into his kingship. David is the anointed king. And so he writes this psalm, and it says that these rulers and these kings, they're going to set themselves against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, "Let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs, and the Lord holds them in derision. And then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill, and I will tell the decree of the Lord, said to me, You are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of your earth your possession." we have this father-son relationship being reflected in David and the way he relates to God. He is the king and he is the son. We also see this same kind of imagery being foisted upon Israel, just the people of Israel in general. So in Hosea chapter 11, it says, "Out of Egypt I called my son." This is a verse that is then quoted later in Matthew chapter 2 regarding Jesus. See, all these are pictures. This is called typology. These are all pictures of what God is ultimately moving towards. Right now, the anointed is a king, and he has a throne, and he has a relationship with God that is very similar to a father and a son. But he is only foreshadowing an eventual king who will sit on the throne forever, and his relationship with God won't be like a father and son. It will be a father and son relationship. These are types that push us to an eventual thing that God is going to do in total fulfillment. David is a kind of Christ in the Old Testament. It's why Jesus says in his lineage that he comes specifically from David's line. It's why Davidic psalms are quoted in fulfillment of the things that happen in his life. It's why there is so much emphasis on the fact that he will go to the right hand of his father and be given a throne and dominion and authority and a scepter forever. Because he is the Davidic king. David is kind of prompting us to look forward and understand God is doing something. He's setting a precedent here. He's going to continue this, and it's going to eventually work itself out in greater fulfillment. So there's a lot of messianic fulfillment that takes place in this. And we see it in David's life. This is where I'll end. We see it in David's life. So David is anointed to be king in 1 Samuel. And then what happens? He suffers persecution at the hands of his people, primarily Saul and his kingdom. He is made destitute. He suffers greatly. And then he rises eventually to the throne and unifies the kingdom during his time. So anointing, suffering, ascension. This is exactly the picture of Jesus. Anointed at baptism, suffering at the hands of his people, ultimately ascending later in his story. David tells us a lot about Jesus. A lot about Jesus. It's one of the reasons why I love Samuel so much. We will eventually study it verse by verse in our Bible study, but I wanted to riddle us with horror and darkness for the fall, so we're studying Judges instead. We'll have some hope at the end of that with maybe Samuel after that. Any final closing questions? We're right at 8:15. Yeah. Yeah. So the question online is, do I think that verses like Ruth, where you go, I'll go, where you say, I'll say, are taken out of context, as is common in the Old Testament? You could not have thrown me an underhanded softball to hit out of the ballpark any better than what you just did. Yes, I think that is absolutely the case. I think that the Old Testament is a cherry orchard that we just pick to serve our purpose. It's why I do this class. It's why I've done it a second time, because I believe that the Old Testament is instrumental in really getting the cool details of the New Testament. And what I found in evangelical circles is not that, but is these sort of Mardel coffee cup Bible verses that are so far out of their original context. It's like I laugh so I don't cry. And again, when we talk about just the heritage of God's people and the expectation of God's people to carry the message to your children and the next generation, and whenever we find generations in Scripture where this hasn't been done and the atrocities that follow, it becomes all the more important for the church to learn from these things. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, these things happen to teach us something. They happen for our benefit, to instruct us. In other words, don't make the same mistakes that happened over and over and over again. Learn from it. Learn from these things. And so, yeah, I think it's super important that the Old Testament is awesome. Like, it's so cool. There's so many cool stories and weird stories, and they don't need to be like, 20th century Christianized into some like VBS package. They're awesome on their own. Judges. I'm prepared. I wrote the lesson 1 this week for Judges, and I'm so excited about it because it's so brutal. It's so like not the Bible story you want to tell your kids, and yet it's in the Bible. And so it's funny to me, like when people, I talk about this in the intro to it, that when people are like, I don't like to read books or watch movies that have violence. I don't want it to, cloud my mind. I'm like, well, have you read Judges? Why is it okay if it's in the Bible? So that's what it forces us to do. It forces us to either come to terms with the fact that violence is a part of our existence and we have to know how to handle it and what to do with it, or we can just write it off and ignore it, which is often what we do. And that's not a good place at all. I'm actually writing an article right now for another ministry that's comparing Judges to the new movie Suicide Squad. And my point in it is that I think movies like that are intriguing for people because the story in both of them is that if God can use these like self-centered, absolute dumpster fire human beings to accomplish his purpose, then he can use me too. And that's a good message to get. So maybe a little more than you bargained for, but yes, to answer your question, I think that the Old Testament is often really misunderstood and kind of pulled out to sort of, paint this other picture that is not as good as the original picture. So, yeah.
So are you going to give us a copy of the article when you're done?
I will link it on my page. I have to go through a whole proofing process, but I've written for them before. Actually, this shirt that I'm wearing right now, Mockingbird Ministries. I love Imbird, David Zoll, all the people over there are great. Occasionally when I write, I'm able to do that, and it's awesome, and they're great. So, yeah, I'll let you know when it happens. I've written another one on another horror movie, and so if you're interested in reading that, just message me. I'll send it to you. It's kind of my thing. All right. God bless y'all.